how Alfred Nobel created the Nobel Prize and changed history. What if one of the most respected prizes in the world was born from explosives, controversy, and a man who may have feared how history would remember him? What if the award, now linked with brilliance, peace, medicine, science, and literature, did not begin in a grand government hall, but inside the final wishes of a private inventor? The story of the Nobel Prize is not just the story of a famous award. It is the story of legacy, reputation, ambition, and one man's decision to turn wealth into something greater than himself. Today, when people hear the words Nobel Prize, they think of greatness. They think of world-changing discoveries, unforgettable books, life-saving medical breakthroughs, and courageous efforts to reduce conflict. The Nobel Prize sounds timeless, almost as if it has always existed. But it had a beginning, and that beginning was dramatic, surprising, and deeply human. To understand the history and origin of the Nobel Prize, we have to begin with the man whose name it carries, Alfred Nobel. Alfred Nobel was born in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1833. He came from a family shaped by engineering, invention, and practical problem-solving. His father was an inventor and engineer, so Alfred grew up in an environment where tools, experiments, ideas, and mechanical thinking were part of everyday life. This was not the world of luxury or idle comfort. It was the world of making, testing, building, and taking risks. From an early age, Alfred Nobel was surrounded by the energy of innovation. As he grew older, he developed into far more than just an inventor. He became a chemist, businessman, industrialist, and writer. He was curious about science, but he was also interested in literature and philosophy. That combination is important because it helps explain why the Nobel Prize was never limited to only one kind of achievement. It reflected the mind of a man who respected both laboratory discoveries and the power of words. Still, if there is one invention that forever shaped Alfred Nobel's public image, it was dynamite. In the 19th century, the world was changing fast. Nations were expanding railroads, digging tunnels, opening mines, building canals, and cutting through mountains to connect places that had once seemed far apart. Construction on that scale required powerful blasting methods. Explosives existed, but many were unstable and dangerously unpredictable. Alfred Nobel worked with nitroglycerin, a substance with great force but terrible instability. It could explode suddenly and cause deadly accidents. Nobel's major breakthrough came when he found a way to make this explosive easier and safer to handle. By combining nitroglycerin with an absorbent material, he created a more stable substance that could be shaped into rods and used more practically in blasting operations. He patented this invention in 1867 and gave it a name the world would never forget: dynamite. This invention transformed industry. It made major construction and mining work faster and more efficient. It helped people carve railways through rock, open access to natural resources, and build infrastructure on a scale that had once been extremely difficult. In that sense, Alfred Nobel helped reshape the physical world. Mountains, tunnels, roads, and industrial projects all carried some trace of his influence. But the story was never simple. The same force that could help build roads and tunnels could also be used in war and destruction. That is one of the great tensions in Alfred Nobel's life. He was an inventor whose work could serve progress, but also violence. And he understood that inventions rarely belong only to the intentions of their creators. Once released into the world, they can be used in ways the inventor never fully controls. His life was also marked by personal tragedy. Experiments involving explosive materials were dangerous and accidents occurred. One blast took the life of his younger brother Emil. That kind of event does not vanish from a person's memory. It becomes part of how they understand risk, consequence, and the cost of discovery. Alfred Nobel knew that innovation could bring success, but he also knew it could bring grief. Over time, his inventions made him very wealthy. He did not stay a local inventor with a single workshop. He built businesses, factories, and laboratories across different countries. He became an international industrial figure, holding hundreds of patents and controlling a major business network. By the end of his life, he had become one of the most successful inventors and entrepreneurs of his era. And yet, for all his wealth and success, Alfred Nobel remained a complex man. He was not only concerned with commerce, he read deeply. He wrote poetry and dramatic works. He reflected on human nature, morality, and civilization. That inner side of his character matters because it helps explain why his final legacy was not another factory, another industrial company, or another invention. Instead, it was an idea. That idea would become the Nobel Prize. Near the end of his life, Alfred Nobel made a decision that shocked many people around him. In his final will, signed in Paris in 1895, he declared that the bulk of his fortune should be used to create annual prizes for those who had done the greatest good for humanity. It was a bold and unusual instruction. Rather than distributing most of his wealth in the traditional way, he chose to direct it toward an international system of recognition. That choice is what gave birth to the Nobel Prize. This was not a vague suggestion. Nobel was specific. He did not simply say that his money should go to education or charity in general. He identified areas in which the prizes should be awarded. The original categories were physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine, literature, and peace. Each of these represented a different way human beings could improve the world. Science could expand knowledge. Medicine could reduce suffering. Literature could shape thought and feeling. Peace efforts could reduce conflict and protect human dignity. That range tells us something profound about how Alfred Nobel saw civilization. He did not believe humanity advanced only through machines or industry. He believed progress also depended on ideas, art, healing, and moral courage. He also assigned the responsibility for choosing the winners. Scientific institutions in Sweden would handle the awards for physics, chemistry, and medicine. The Swedish Academy would choose the literature laureate. The Peace Prize, however, would be selected by a committee in Norway. That decision still stands out as one of the most interesting parts of Nobel's will. Even today, the Peace Prize is awarded in Oslo, while the other major Nobel Prizes are awarded in Stockholm. Why did Nobel make that choice? Historians have discussed it for years, but the exact reason remains uncertain. What is clear is that this decision became one of the defining features of the Nobel tradition. When Alfred Nobel died in 1896 in San Remo, Italy, his will was opened, and the reaction was immediate. Many were stunned. Some were confused. Others were unhappy. The will was not welcomed smoothly by everyone. Family members objected. Legal and administrative questions arose. Some influential figures were doubtful or resistant. In simple terms, turning Nobel's last wishes into reality was not easy. This is one of the most important parts of the Nobel Prize story, because the prize did not simply appear the moment Nobel died. It had to be built, defended, organized, and protected. There were legal issues, financial questions, and institutional arrangements that had to be solved before the first prize could ever be awarded. Two men played especially important roles in carrying out Nobel's wishes: Ragnar Zollman and Rudolf Liljequist, the executors of his will. They worked through the complications and helped transform a controversial document into a functioning institution. Their work was essential. Without that persistence, Alfred Nobel's idea might have remained only a dramatic but unrealized plan. Eventually, the Nobel Foundation was established to manage the fortune and oversee the practical side of the prize system. This foundation became the structure that gave Nobel's idea permanence. It handled the financial management of the estate and created a stable framework that could support annual awards over the long term. That mattered enormously. An award of this kind could not survive on reputation alone. It needed financial discipline, organization, and continuity. Nobel had left behind not only a dream, but also the resources to make that dream sustainable. The foundation's role was to ensure that the money would be managed wisely, so the prizes could continue year after year, generation after generation. Then came the moment that turned intention into history. In 1901, 5 years after Alfred Nobel's death, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded. That was the true public beginning of the Nobel era. At that point, the award was no longer just a remarkable clause in a will. It had become a living institution. The first ceremony carried enormous symbolic weight. It announced to the world that a new kind of honor had arrived. This was not a prize for royal birth, inherited power, or military conquest. It was a prize for contribution. It recognized the people whose work had genuinely advanced human life, knowledge, and values. That idea was revolutionary in its own way. The Nobel Prize said that the highest form of distinction should go not to those who simply possessed power, but to those who used their minds, talent, or courage to benefit others. That message gave the prize a special moral force from the beginning. As the years passed, the Nobel Prize grew into one of the most prestigious recognitions on Earth. Each award added to its reputation. Scientists whose discoveries changed our understanding of nature, doctors and researchers whose work saved lives, writers whose words crossed borders and generations, peacemakers who stood against violence and injustice. The Nobel Prize became more than an award. It became a global symbol. Part of its strength came from the categories Alfred Nobel originally selected. They touched the core forces that shape civilization. Physics and chemistry opened the secrets of matter and energy. Medicine addressed health and survival. Literature gave voice to human emotion, memory, and truth. Peace spoke to the deepest hope of all, that human beings might learn to live without destroying one another. That combination made the Nobel Prize feel larger than any single field. It reflected a complete vision of human progress. Over time, one more major prize became associated with the Nobel name. In 1969, an economics award was introduced in memory of Alfred Nobel. Although it was added later and was not part of his original will, it became widely linked with the Nobel tradition and is often spoken of alongside the original prizes. Its arrival showed how strong the Nobel name had become. Decades after his death, new institutions still wanted to connect themselves to the standard he had established. Another reason the Nobel Prize remains so powerful is the way it honors memory. Every year, the awards are presented on December 10th, the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. That date gives the ceremony a quiet, emotional meaning. Each prize is not only a celebration of present achievement, it is also a reminder of the man whose final decision made the entire institution possible. That creates a unique kind of continuity. Every laureate stands in the present, but the ceremony itself reaches back to the 19th century, to a man who decided that wealth should serve something beyond private inheritance. In that sense, each Nobel ceremony is both a tribute and a renewal. The prize has also survived an extraordinary amount of history. It has continued through world wars, political upheavals, scientific revolutions, cultural shifts, and dramatic changes in global power. Few institutions created by private will have lasted with such influence. The Nobel Prize managed to do so because its purpose was large enough to stay relevant. As long as humanity continues to value discovery, healing, literature, and peace, the idea behind the Nobel Prize remains alive. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Nobel Prize is what it reveals about Alfred Nobel himself. Here was a man famous for inventions related to explosive force, a man who built factories, earned immense wealth, and helped shape an industrial age. Yet his final act was not to celebrate destruction, profit, or power. It was to reward service to humanity. That contrast is what makes his story unforgettable. Some people have suggested that Nobel wanted to guide how history would remember him. Whether that was his main motive or only one part of it, the result is undeniable. His name became attached not merely to dynamite, but to excellence, conscience, and human advancement. That is one of the greatest transformations of reputation in modern history. And that is why the origin of the Nobel Prize feels so compelling. It is not just the beginning of an award. It is the meeting point of invention and morality, success and responsibility, wealth and legacy. It asks a timeless question: what do we leave behind when our life's work is finished? For Alfred Nobel, the answer was extraordinary. He left behind a challenge to every generation. He created a system that asks the world again and again, who has truly improved life for others? Who has pushed knowledge forward? Who has reduced suffering? Who has written something unforgettable? Who has worked for peace in a world that constantly struggles to keep it? That is why the Nobel Prize still matters so much. It does not reward noise. It does not reward mere popularity. It aims to recognize work of lasting consequence. In a world often distracted by trends and short attention spans, the Nobel Prize continues to stand for depth, seriousness, and enduring value. So when you hear the words Nobel Prize, remember that behind them is a much richer story than most people realize. It begins in Sweden in 1833 with the birth of Alfred Nobel. It moves through dangerous experiments, industrial success, personal tragedy, and global business. It reaches a decisive turning point in 1895 with the writing of a will. It faces resistance after Nobel's death in 1896. It becomes real with organization, financial structure, and determination. And then, in 1901, it steps onto the world stage as one of the greatest honors humanity has ever created. That is the true history and origin of the Nobel Prize. It is the story of how one man's fortune became a permanent force for recognizing human achievement. It is the story of how an inventor's final decision outlived factories, patents, and even his own era. And it is the story of a name that became bigger than the man himself. The Nobel Prize endures because it speaks to something timeless inside us. We want discovery to matter. We want healing to matter. We want words to matter. We want peace to matter. Alfred Nobel found a way to place those values into a lasting institution, and more than a century later, the world is still listening. And that is what makes this story so powerful. It starts with one life, but it expands into generations. It begins with a man, but it grows into a global tradition. It was born from a final written wish, but it became one of the world's greatest symbols of achievement. If this story changed the way you see the Nobel Prize, then stay with that feeling, because history is full of surprising beginnings, powerful turning points, and hidden stories behind the names we think we already know. and the next story may be just as unforgettable. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy, like, comment, and subscribe.